Okay, well, welcome, brave conversationalists. We are here welcoming Drew Neal to the podcast. I'm super excited because we're starting a new season, and I think it's a time for an upgrade in our ability to think about the world and what's happening in this crazy world that we live in. And I can't think of anybody better than Drew Neal. If you don't know Drew, write his name down, just start following him because he's really moving in some interesting areas. He is a solutionary, which we'll find out what that term means in a little bit. He's a life coach. He's a consultant, especially in business, and a strategist. I'm probably going to be leaving some things out. He actually has a church called Generation One. They're over there in Michigan. It's a thriving church. He's what you call a hybrid leader, and I love that term because it kind of blows the limits off what he's able to do. And so, he has devoted his life's work to the pursuit of wisdom. And I really can't think of anything that's more needed in our culture, in our society, for every single person. It's really not enough to have a conventional type of wisdom anymore. We need an upgrade in our wisdom. And I'm super excited about what he has to share with us about that. And so I guess we could start, Drew, by just saying, just asking the question, what is a solutionary? What's this term that you've coined?
Yeah, well, Leigh, so good to be on the podcast and excited to be here having a brave conversation today. Shouldn't be boring by any means because, I think you and I just kind of like to say it how it is. But so thank you so much. And solutionary is, basically, to summarize it very quickly, it's someone who really understands that solutions are meant to dignify people with value. And there's a lot of people who have solutions today, in government or in business, in faith-based communities, if you will. But most of the time, solutions are designed to really kind of meet the needs of the few. And at least the solutions that get adopted oftentimes in the culture. And so I really believe that we need people who are really going to begin to partner with visionaries and missionaries, if you will, those who carry mission and those who have vision. There's a third component that's needed, that really allows for people to understand how to integrate solutions into dignifying people with value. So I think there's something powerful about this idea of saying, hey, our purpose is meant to solve a problem. And when we understand what problem our purpose solves, we can begin to understand the people that need those types of solutions, adopt those people, so to speak, and then dignify them with insurmountable value by, taking on their challenges. And so solutionary has been, I didn't make up the word, but I'm definitely elevating the word to become much more largely known as a noun, not just as an adjective. Mm-hmm. And I believe that we can be solutionaries and solve the world's greatest challenges. So
we're not just elevating problems. We're actually, the answer to the problems, that people can be an answer, right?
Very much so. And, and even, and that would be the diagnosis piece of who we are, the grievance piece of who we are can be quick to want to elevate, injustice, mm-hmm. Especially right now. And there is a need to make sure that the stories of injustice are told. There's a need for us to make sure that we are bringing that true sense of doing right by people. But we also got to have a solution for the system, in the moments where systems are not performing correctly and not dignifying people with value. We do have to understand, well, how are we actually going to fix this? Because just bringing awareness to the challenge is not actually going to advance us, right? And so even right now, we have a lot of people in micro segments of society who are not being dignified with value in some of the systems of how we govern our world, how we relate, how we move. And yet we need macro solutions, because if you make adjustments just for the micro, well, it's only going to work for the few. And we already know how solutions that work for the few turn out. Eventually someone gets quite upset. They get marginalized. And so we're actually here not to disempower certain groups to hyper elevate others, but we really want to say, how do we elevate everyone together? How do we come up with solutions that dignify all with value? How do we come up with solutions that actually can change the world around us and not just benefit the person who came up with the solution or just a small group of people who are maybe in, in cahoots or in close proximity to the person who's bringing that solution. So yeah, I think we need a solutionary mindset that's really going to fix things and not just become, advance more political agendas.
Yeah, and it's not all that simple because you're having to think multidimensional, right? You're having to think about the macro and the micro, and it's not just this cut and dry thing. Oh, why don't you just think this way? Why don't you just do this? Because you're
Yeah,
talking
why
about,
don't you just behave like me? It's
yeah,
just very easy for us to want to govern. It's very easy for us to strategize according to our own personal benefit, and it's not an evil thing.
mhm,
It's a, where it's just the landing point of where people are at in their process of growing in self-awareness. Mostly, it's like
mhm,
I'm very aware of my need, but I'm not self-aware enough to know how people are experiencing me
mhm.
when I project only a limited solution that meets my need or people that function, live like me, talk, behave like me. So I think there's an increase in emotional intelligence that's needed so that
Mhm.
we can become aware of how solutions apply for all sects of society when the solution is needed for all sects of society.
Yeah, and I think that's what we're trying to do with Brave Conversations is really get people out of their own, just be able to come to the table fully with who you are and be honest about that, but then also really invite others into that. And when you talk about dignity, I think there's not really a greater dignity that you can give to somebody than inviting them into a conversation and saying, here, I want to hear you. Like, I really do. I don't want to just bark at you. I don't want to just act like I'm hearing you. I want to really hear you and be heard as well. I think there's just something so beautiful about that back and forth.
Yeah, well, I think we communicate according to the value of a relationship. And so, whether it's in business, it's in our families, it's in the community, no matter how you define the relationship, friendship, partnership, boss, employee, no matter how it's defined, spouses, if you will, um, the value of that relationship is connected to how willing we are to speak about the things that we're thinking about.
Hmm.
And, you know, relationships deserve the opportunity to really be heard and then come to conclusions based on the joint interest of both parties, not just the hyper elevation of one over the other. And so, what does it look like, for us to have these conversations? We have to have conversations where we disagree. If we
Yeah.
don't have conversations where we're disagreeing, we'll actually never grow and learn how we can adapt, how we can make adjustments and be willing to compromise, because ultimately healthy progress is found when two are compromising for a higher good. And we need more of that. So I commend you, Leigh, for kind of paving the way
Yeah.
and in your sphere and bringing these brave conversations forward.
Yeah. Well, one thing I really wanted you to talk about was this idea about paradigms and paradoxes. I found this fascinating how you described it. And that's really where I'm trying to live. I'm trying to find those sides of it and really find the wisdom therein. So explain that to us.
Yeah, well, there is oftentimes when you're looking at, say, a reflexive form of problem solving, people are very, uh, very apt to dig their heels in extreme perspectives that oppose one another. And
Right.
we see, at the simplest form, it's left and right, right and wrong, male and female, black and white,
Mhm.
Republican, Democrat. I mean, we can start to talk about the different constructs in society where there's only two options and it's and or,
Mhm.
and it really is a lower form of thinking to believe that, that there's only, one person's going to be right and there's only two options. Uh,
Mhm. Win or lose. Yep.
and what I've found though is, the us and them mindset that's found in those conversations rarely ever leads to, a solution that's going to dignify people with value. It's oftentimes going to the solution will come at the expense of 50% of the people represented in that kind of us and them, black or white kind of idea. And so, but when there's two perspectives, oftentimes each perspective is a paradigm. It's my vantage point,
Right.
of how I see things. And people camp in these extremes. And, when you look at even, say, the political landscape right now, I think politics in America has really suffered in certain points and instances because we're only a two-party system, because it says if you don't believe exactly how I believe, there's, or exactly how the other people believe, that there's not really a home for you.
Mm-hmm.
And it's similar, even in, you know, in and how we define race. If you're, if your mom is Caucasian and your dad is African American, where do you fit? If English isn't your first language in America, where do you fit?
Mm-hmm.
There's all these hybrids, if you will, if you want to use that language of the leadership model that I kind of come from.
Mm-hmm.
It's this idea that, we can be both and not have to fit in the and or, scenario.
Yeah.
And so the and or scenario says that you're either one or the other, and the one vantage point is against the other vantage point. And so that's paradigm and extremes.
Right.
But the idea of paradox is that these two paradigms hold in tension a higher form of truth, and it creates the paradox.
Mm-hmm.
And so it is a paradox that a fruit has to die and fall off the branch, drop its seeds to ultimately live again.
Mm-hmm.
And it's in the paradox of life and death, where vegetation and fruit, if you will, is able to grow. It's in the tension of in our, in society, where we see that a man and a woman, create a higher level of being and have offspring. It's in the tension. We can go down through all these different constructs in society, and, even in politics, it's actually in the tension of Republicans and Democrats that we protect a constitution,
Mm-hmm.
and we preserve our nation. It's in the tension, not in the perfect arrival of the Democrat, or the perfect arrival of understanding by the Republican.
Right.
It's actually in the tension of these two worlds, that we see higher forms of truth or higher ways and constructs of living. And so when you live in this us and them type of perspective, the them become the enemy very quickly. And you end up demonizing those individuals to try to elevate your principles. And once you demonize those individuals, you're willing to cut them off at all costs, which
Mm-hmm.
then allows you to become blind to the other paradigm that's necessary to hold the tension of this higher truth of the paradox that's available. And so,
Mm-hmm.
there's a lot of beauty available when we're able to kind of stop and find value in the opposing viewpoints that we carry, and understand what's the motivation, what's the need that's
Right.
attempting to be met in this scenario, and beginning to think through those things and finding a way for us to hold the value that's found in the opposing viewpoint, and say what can be possible when the value in my position and the value in that position can really come together, and
Yeah.
how do we walk those things out.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think about that. I think about the extremes of those two sides. And when I actually talk to real people, usually the extreme isn't what we think it is. I mean, the straw man, if you will, is really an illusion. That a lot of people are way more complex than that. And that we do see things, they see the merit of the other side. I mean, it's just that we might have different order that we prioritize them in, but a lot of us as Americans have a lot of the same values. And I find that when I talk to real people, not just read headlines, of what's going on out there.
Yeah, we agree on way more than we disagree on, because ultimately, I believe humans are generally good.
Mm-hmm.
I haven't met very many downright evil people, and I've worked in 18 different nations around the world, governments, businesses, churches, I've just met tens and tens of thousands of people personally and had these exchanges where, it's hard to find an evil individual.
Mhm.
And when you find that someone has an agenda that's against someone else, they're largely uninformed. And it's in their lack of, it's in their ignorance, really, that they drive their agenda at the expense of other people. And
Mhm.
that's where people, buy into a narrative, they buy into this idea, and they let, concepts and lack of human interaction drive them. And, it's just very easy, today in our political situation to say, to let, alt-right and Antifa try to define two
Right,
perspectives.
right.
And these are very inhumane vantage points. These are
Mhm.
extreme vantage points by a very small number of people that are
Mhm.
trying to, really create tension and make enemies.
Yeah.
And it's like, if you're driving down the street and you're a Democrat, because of the extreme liberalism, you get triggered. It wants to try to trigger you when you see that Trump Pence election sign. It's the same for the Republican
Mhm.
driving down the street and sees Biden Harris, like, I don't, you were my
Mhm.
neighbor and I thought I liked you. It's like, no, 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 no. That's that you're falling into the trap here of limited thinking.
Yeah.
And it's actually childish thinking.
Mhm.
My toy. It's not conceivable that we could actually share this toy, that we could both possess it and have fun, and ultimately still me go home with it at the end of the day. And so
Yeah.
there's a real need for maturity for us to understand the humanity. And
Mhm.
and I found that you know the there's I'm a conservative, but there's great value in the position of representing the interests of people who've been marginalized
Mhm.
and held by the Democrat Party. Like, there's value in their position
Yeah.
of what they tried to say is their position versus, it's marketed that Republicans don't care about people, especially minorities and,
Yeah.
people who are oppressed by the system.
Mhm.
And we could, I don't want to get into all the politics of that in this moment, because I don't think that's the direction we really want to
Mhm.
go. But, ultimately, as a conservative, I've given my life actually for the oppressed. I've given my life for the marginalized. And I could tell you all the stories of how that I don't need to tell publicly and get all the credit for to try to validate my position. But I mean, Republicans are the most generous people that I've ever met in my life.
Mhm.
And I'm surrounded by very generous
Mhm.
people, remarkably generous people.
Mhm.
And so the narrative, once you start to talk, you begin to find out that the narrative doesn't always fit, and
Yeah.
and of course, everyone that's in the Democratic Party they're not all Antifa. They're not
Yeah.
all tearing businesses down
Right.
right now. They're not, the hirelings showing up at different rallies and trying to cause a nuisance. And
Mhm.
so I think it's important for us to realize that solutions have to be connected to people. And when
Mhm.
you understand people and their needs, and you're able to dignify people with value in that one-on-one, that two-on-two, those
Mhm.
small group moments, focus groups, and you're just able to really have so much more impact.
Yeah. When you talk about people, it seems like a lot of times when we have political discourse, we tend to just not think about actual people. We tend to actually, and I think part of this is I don't know, maybe as a person of faith, sometimes I think we divorce our faith um from politics. Like, we have this idea in America that, separation of church and state means that, we're more holy if we keep this over here, right? And we keep these separate. But then I wonder, no wonder we're in the mess we are if we don't bring our faith to bear in some of these scenarios, and we don't bring the fruit of the Holy Spirit, actual, you know um the values that we hold in every other conversation. We kind of just throw them out the window sometimes when we talk about politics for some reason.
Yeah, well, I think the challenge with, with church and state is really some of the fundamental ideas of how, the church has handled its perspective of other religions. I think is where things get really complicated for US political interests, because ultimately the evangelical movement of what we know today, the foundation of it has been very us and them. And it's
Mm-hmm.
been very hyper exclusive in the sense of, if you don't, worship the way that I worship and pray to God the way that I pray to God on Sunday morning with these certain people and constructs in place, well, then there's no room for even exploring. It's like, you got to make a decision right now.
Yeah.
And, and we, Christians oppressed, you know, Protestants oppressed the Catholics, and the
Yeah.
Catholics oppressed the Protestants. And,
Right.
and there really wasn't freedom and liberty for all.
Mm-hmm.
Historically, even coming into America, I know I have an Irish heritage, and, my heritage, my forefathers changed their last name because they were Catholics and
Mm.
coming into a Protestant in America. And it was a challenge, and that had to be overcome. And so I think that, I know for yourself and myself, Leigh, our faith in God has very much been about a goodness and a love and a temperance and a kindness and a generosity that flows through it, that really says, all people should be able to benefit
Mm-hmm.
from these values. And ultimately, the integration of these values represented in our faith is about the proliferation of freedom, and
Right.
not the proliferation of a denomination
Mm-hmm.
or a religious ceremony trying to get these people to perform and behave the way that I do.
Right.
And so I think there's a tension there, because when most people think about church and state, they're thinking about state being the governance of freedom, and church being the governance of, of whether or not I qualify as being a good human or not. And
Mm-hmm.
so there's varying levels of how people approach that and what they think about it. And so I'm okay with the commingling of faith as a personal
Yes.
motivator,
Yes.
and it being represented in why I'm interacting politics, as long as it still says that people have the freedom to choose
Yes.
who they are and how they express, even if it goes against, my
Right.
preference
Right.
of how I would, prefer to present myself, how I would prefer to manage myself,
Yeah.
because ultimately truth should set people free.
Mm-hmm.
And if the form of truth that people are in their faith doesn't ultimately set people free, then we are violating the rights of humanity. And so I think it's important for us to make sure that we are, yes, moral, and yes, leading with
Mm-hmm.
our conviction and building a world that we want to live in. And yet, how do we also empower people and honor people so that we're not just overriding the rights of humanity in the midst of that? So it's
Right.
very multidimensional,
Yeah.
very complicated.
Yeah.
And but I'm excited because I think that the church world and America is starting to have these really powerful conversations, and we're
Mm-hmm.
starting to figure it out.
Yeah. I
And
mean,
so I think kind of in the late 60s, early 70s, we saw an abuse of power in the church when it came to politics and these kind of gross assumptions of what it meant to be Christian in America. And it was more or less a box that got checked and not a conviction of what led people's lives. And so I
yeah.
think the church has kind of detoxed some of that politicized Christianity, and we're
Mm-hmm.
opening up this idea of authentic faith led by love and goodness and kindness that really is representative of the good of humanity, and not just religious rite and ritual. And so,
Mm-hmm.
but we lost some of our influence because of that. And I'm excited to regain some of that influence, but done in a way that really is for freedom for all. So
Yeah. Yeah. We're not just creating another tribe to set up against another tribe. Yeah. And, and I love how I think it's revolutionary how you say that truth needs to set people free. I mean, we know the truth sets people free. We know that phrase, but we don't really connect truth and freedom all the time. And I think that's revolutionary to think that if I sit down and have a conversation with someone and that person doesn't feel more free, like I haven't done my job, right? And being, inviting them to the table fully.
yeah, 100%. It's so easy to feel good about what I believe when something benefits me. And
Mm-hmm.
so, my truth is,
Mm-hmm.
is kind of a thing in the culture right now, have your truth. And well, this is my truth. And I don't care if you disagree because this is my truth. And ultimately what people mean when they say that is this is what works for me. And it's a little bit of a immature response because ultimately for something to be true, it needs to be as applicably true for all as possible.
Mm-hmm.
And of course, I love numbers, I love data, and I love theories that we've built our world around. Uh, Truth is multidimensional because there is personal experience involved in what we perceive to be truth. There is data, and then there's also, we hold things true also according to the relationships that we have. And so there is this, kind of reflexive path to truth.
Mm-hmm.
There's this, cognitive path to truth. And then there's an empathic path to truth. And everyone kind of holds their vantage points according to their key motivators and what they're trying to accomplish. And so I think it takes wisdom for us to understand this idea of paradox, this idea of dimensionalism when it comes to how I think about things at face value versus things, that could be nuanced, and things that could be more true when I hold other people's perspectives connected to it. Or, there's lots of people who are willing to compromise what they think is true when they fall in love.
That's true.
And because love is blind, as they say.
Mm-hmm.
And it's not that it's blind, it's just that we value connection over being right. Ultimately, we're hardwired as in society, in our humanity, to decide to believe
Mm-hmm.
in connection more than a certain vantage point. And
Mm.
so we're very much driven to want to find truth through people, not find truth outside of people. And so
Mm-hmm.
that's also, one of the places where I think faith, our perspective in faith, is really gaining maturity and wisdom, is that we're realizing that faith is, and who God is a construct inside of us. It's not a construct outside of us. And
Mm-hmm.
so when you find truth, when you find God in people, you're really able to see depths of who God is that you wouldn't normally be able to find.
Yeah.
And so I think you duplicate that, in a bunch of different principles, you can see it. And so ultimately truth, to be the highest form of truth, is going to be measured by how many people it sets free.
Yeah.
And I think that's a powerful
Wow.
way to begin to think about it.
Wow. Yeah. So you mentioned cognitive, empathic, and reflexive. Um, I think we know what cognitive is. That's our brain, our what we're actually thinking, and a lot of the conversations usually get centered around that, I think, when we're having intellectual discussions. But talk a little bit more about reflexive and empathic.
Yeah. So I'll just even say just a couple quick things on, on cognitive truth. This
Yeah.
is the idea that, you know, uh, it is kind of funny. You can make the data say whatever you really want it to say if you squeeze
True.
it and
Yeah.
manipulate it and knead it and do all the things.
Yeah.
So ultimately, truth is still subjective, even with analytics. But
True.
there is, there's kind of like this idea of there's a face value. It's what you immediately perceive to be true. And then when you dig deeper, there's secondary truths that you can find there. And then there's also, when something sits alongside of when data as a as a center point has another collection of data that maybe
Mhm.
indirectly relates to it. Now there's a third layer of nuance.
Right.
And then oftentimes there's also kind of a mysterious thing, a phenomenon that we can measure on some level that has an indirect impact. And so
Hmm.
there's dimensional layers of understanding cognitively that we can attempt to understand and pursue, that we see maybe similar like in physics.
Mhm.
And then there's this idea of a reflexive path to truth, which is that idea of that I went after earlier about paradigms held in a paradox. And so it's just this idea that that I'm able to come off of my vantage point to want to see something that completely opposes me, to
Mhm.
then say, what happens when these two vantage points come together? When
Mhm.
they come together, do they make a higher truth?
Yeah.
Um, and so cognitive is a path that says I build on one step and I go higher and higher. And reflexive is, well, two things oppose one another. They're not foundational one another. It's actually in the conflict or in the connection of resistance that something higher is found. And
Right.
then the empathic form is just the idea that we learn through connection. We learn through discovery through people. It's more of this social and emotional intelligence path of saying, hey, I'm willing to learn through your experience
Mhm.
what data maybe doesn't measure currently, or what you would never say in confrontation, or maybe what I would never want to explore myself, simply because my subconscious brain thinks it's too much work to to want to go there. But in my need of connection to you, I discover and you pull me into an
Mm.
experience that allows me to think differently.
Wow. Yeah,
And
I can
so
see all those things happening that we've done on Brave Conversations. Yeah, that reflexive is really interesting because I constantly think about that. I think about the paradox a lot, or the paradigms, and then I'm always trying to go, okay, in the middle, like if there was overlapping, and there was that middle portion where I'm trying to find wisdom in between those two. I try to like say, okay, what's the specific relationship between these two? When is this more right, and when is that more right? And if I can really become clear around that portion, I feel like I'm coming closer to wisdom.
yeah, I mean, that's exactly what you're doing, is you're creating a platform that says we disagree, but there's value in our disagreement. So if we can discover, if we can, you know, set down our sword here
Hmm.
and be willing just to come over across enemy lines, and then see things from this perspective, we'll be able to attain value in that place that otherwise we'll never gain from our trenches. And
Yeah.
so, I love the stories of, in the Second World War where, you know, basically, the uh, the soldiers would call kind of their own mini ceasefire, and
Hmm.
people would get out of the trenches and they'd get around a fire and share stories, or
Yeah.
try to communicate cross languages, and they'd show one another pictures of their children or their spouse or whatever, and the humanity would begin to come out of the fact that, hey, I don't really see eye to eye
Hmm.
because I'm too far away, of the person who's got the rifle pointing my direction.
Hmm.
It's easy to pull the trigger, but when that person's a human, it gets much more complicated.
Hmm.
And it really shifted the course of different battles and places. And so I think it's important that if we're going to dignify humanity as valuable, that we have to get out of this kind of barbaric behavior of saying, if you disagree, you're my enemy. And I really dream about a civilization where there's no war. I think when it comes to understanding the heart of even our faith, our faith, Leigh, for you and I, is founded on peace. It's
Hmm.
actually founded on forgiveness. It's founded on restoration.
Hmm.
And yet also it is founded on conviction. And
Hmm.
so our faith is a paradox, isn't it?
Yeah.
That we hold it as Protestant Christians in this modern era, or
Yeah.
postmodern era, if we want to be technical.
Hmm.
And so it is, but it's necessary for us to begin to elevate those types, that pursuit. And I really believe that is a pursuit that the millennials are going to continue to forward on. I think they carry that as a value, is that we would discover paths of peace. And so it'll be interesting to see what happens next as
Yeah.
we walk some of these
Yeah.
things
I,
out.
I hear a lot of, on the right and the left, I hear a lot of cynicism around this. Like, either that, okay, that's a nice thought, but we're in a war, like we need to defeat the other side, like, and if you don't understand that, or if you think we can just talk our way out of this, like, you're deceiving yourself. And there's this sense that, like, that, yeah, that might have been nice, 20 years ago, but this is not going to work now. It's kind of, it's that cynicism that I sense from people.
Yeah, and yet at the same time, we're more emotionally intelligent than we've ever been as a civilization.
Hmm.
We would have already gone to blows 20 years ago,
Wow.
is what's actually true.
Wow.
We wouldn't have stood, people would have not tolerated the tolerance in our civilization right now is an all-time historic high. We've never been more tolerant, actually.
Wow.
We've never been more passive. This is the most passive aggressive war that we've ever been in culturally. And yet the conflict is deep, and yet the communication is very passive. And so
Hmm.
while there is a lot of posturing and people do get driven to their limits, uh, it will be interesting to see how people choose to behave, because we have, in the NBA right now, we've lost all form of warfare. I mean, the Celtics and the Lakers in the 1980s were, I mean, they were out for blood. I mean, these people were not friends. I mean, and the trash talking that would happen. I mean,
Hmm.
you look at the 1980s and early 90s, the Bulls and the Pistons. This was a
Hmm.
big kind of cultural phenomenon, the Jordan story, right? That
Hmm.
ESPN put out during COVID. Everyone was watching it, commenting on it. The bad boys, the Detroit Pistons, and Jordan finally breaking through. And, I mean, these people literally, I mean, to this day, they hate each other. You walk into the NBA today, I mean, there are no more enemies. I
Hmm.
mean, the trash talking done in the NBA is like, it's all a joke. Like, these people will never come to fisticuffs because they're all homeboys. They're all hanging out, they're all going out and being friends. And
Hmm.
and and actually it's not that fun for sports because we like the rivalry, but
Yeah.
what it speaks to is the development in society that
Uh,
says, hey, I don't actually need you to be my enemy for something good to happen.
hmm.
There doesn't have to be, someone who's a villain for there to be good competition. And
Hmm.
so while there is something great about this idea of competing to win that I think is ultimately good for people to discover that drive, ultimately people are wanting to move out of a success oriented mindset and into a significance
Huh.
oriented mindset.
Wow.
And as we move in out of success, which is the acquisition of things for me, and it is significance, which is about the impact of my life towards others,
Hmm.
we are discovering that there are higher forms of living that are available. And it's actually our wealth. Our wealth is driving us to that point, because the more wealthy we get, the less desperate we are. And so the less desperate we are, the more willing we are to talk, the more willing we are to listen, the more
Mm.
willing we are to do some of these other things. And so capitalism ultimately is changing the world because it's dignified, coming out of the age of kings and queens who
Mm.
owned every ounce of wealth. Now it's like, I mean, if you have a dry shelter over your head and have a car, and you live in America, you're in the 1% of the world right now.
Mm.
We talk about the 1% in America, but if you just live in America and have a shelter and a
Yeah.
car, you're in 1% of the world.
Right.
And it's remarkable. And so
Hmm.
there is, and so it's all about your vantage point, your
Yeah.
perspective, and understanding those things. But I
Yeah.
think ultimately that things are getting better. We are developing as a society, and we're discovering things that we've never operated in before. So it's going to be
Wow.
interesting to see what happens.
Yeah. Do you think that I mean, because not that's a rare opinion to think that things are getting better. It seems like a lot of people just think things are getting worse. And do you think it's because of our narratives that we've been listening to that we kind of feel that way?
Well, yeah, I mean, so ultimately civilizations go in cycles of development. And, I'm very much for, Black Lives Matter, in the sense of us addressing what the next step is to dignify Black Americans with value in America.
Hmm.
I don't support the organization. I honestly, I think that they're leveraging the grievance of Black Americans for their own political agenda, and they're to me, there's no measurable change that they've instigated. There's no community transformation. They are a grievance megaphone platform that's leveraging grievance for a very Marxist agenda that has nothing to do with the benefit of Black Americans. And that sounds political probably, but you can't measure their impact in 7 years for transformation and bettering Black lives in America.
Mm-hmm.
And so I'm very much, but I'm very motivated for creating financial opportunity. I'm very motivated in working with people who are different than me to create those opportunities and dignify people with value.
Mm-hmm.
And so the precipice of what we're experiencing right now in race relations, though, is about what the next step is. And we've been slow in taking our steps in America at, really, taking care of the righting the injustice of slavery that was in America. We've been slow, but we have been steady in our progress. And so nobody wants to go back to the 1960s. No one wants to go back there.
Yeah.
There's no women who want to go back to their pre-voting right days.
Right.
There's no Americans today who want to go back to their forefather country. No one
True.
wants to go back to Serbia. No one wants to go back to Ireland. No one wants to go back to the UK. No one wants to go back to India. None of us want to go back. Like, no one's leaving America over the issues that's going on right now, because actually America is still the best place in the world to live, in my opinion, after I've traveled as much as I have.
Mm-hmm.
And there's great people and great places, but I love America. And
Mm-hmm.
so there's a need for us to see the micro moment that we're in the context of the macro of why America was instigated in the first place. People don't realize that America was solving a problem.
Yeah.
Now, while there's still more problems to solve in civilization, and America in its birth hasn't solved every problem.
Right.
It was solving a problem for a very specific group of people in 1776. Now, more people have gotten included in the responsibility of whose problems we want to solve.
Yeah.
We were solving Spaniards, French, and Brits.
Yep.
Those three people groups had problems and they wanted to solve it. And you can talk about if they did it appropriately, there's all the things, but ultimately America was solving a problem for those three nations and the people who lived there that were oppressed. They were people who did not have equal opportunity. They were not handled justly. They did not live in liberty and freedom for all. And they came to America to birth a nation that ultimately would open up the dignity for all. Now, we haven't been perfect, but we have advanced in a way like no nation has ever seen in the history of mankind. It's remarkable.
Yeah.
And so no one wants to go back, but yet we can't also be blind in our love for America. Love is blind, right? We can't be blind in our love for America that says that there isn't room for a lot more progress.
For sure.
And so that's where, I think, conservatives need to budge right now, is they need to acknowledge the fact that the laws that we've created 200 years ago solved the problem for people who were alive 200 years ago. And the needs today are different. And we need to make sure that the laws of our day are actually serving the interests and the needs of people in our day. And so how do we do that? How do we make sure that there is equal economic opportunity for Blacks in America? And, I have tons of Black American friends who, it is more difficult for them to get a loan and have the same credit score and the same, if not better resume than what I have. I've witnessed it firsthand, these experiences where, there are not always checks and balances in the process that we say is a fair opportunity, because ultimately people are governing these systems and people have issues. They have perceptions, they have biases. And so I think it's important for us to realize that there's a layer for us to pull back of advancement here. And we can acknowledge the need for change without disqualifying our history and our progress. And so I think when we begin to look at that, once again, addressing the micro without throwing out the baby, with the bathwater, and the macro of where we've come from.
Yeah, that's so important, and it just doesn't get a lot of airtime, I guess. Actually coming up with real solutions for some reason doesn't sell as much as as fighting and bickering and who said what when. But I think, yeah, we need to uh, lift up our gaze. Past all the stuff that's trying to distract us, trying to disunify us. I talk about being a peacemaker and a peacekeeper. There's a time when we choose to ignore things to keep peace, like, and not, and then there are times that we choose to lift up the rug and find out what's under there, because it's not as smooth as it should, as we think it is on the outside. So there are those, there's different ways of making peace, and sometimes it doesn't always look peaceful. It looks a little bit disruptive, but yeah.
Yeah, it is true that there is obviously conflict,
Mhm.
and and boundaries are sometimes required so that we don't just get trampled on,
Yeah.
and as individuals. And so we do have to learn how to say yes and to say no. But one of the powerful things about um, you know uh, Cloud and Townsend, two psychologists
Yeah.
and professors, put out a famous book 20 years ago called Boundaries in Relationships.
Hmm.
And it really set a precedence on this idea that if we're going to have connection or be able to do anything, it's going to come because we've set boundaries and limits, and I'm able to respect your boundaries and your limits, and you're able to respect
Yeah.
my boundaries and my limits. And as you do that, it actually readjusts the boundaries and the limits, because you begin to trust one another more, and you grow in connection,
Hmm.
and greater things are possible as trust increases.
Yeah.
One of the things that people have not understood, even in that, you can talk about boundaries. People are like, yeah, I drew a line in the sand. And people kind of resonate with that idea of I set a boundary or a limit in my life. But
Hmm.
what they don't realize is that healthy boundaries are actually have a door in them. They're
Absolutely.
not walls.
Yes.
There are still access points to move through those things,
Hmm.
because ultimately the good of humanity is founded on the idea of the second chance. And so a powerful question we need to ask ourselves is, in the moments where we need to set limits and set boundaries, how do we also create a path for people to be restored? And so we're seeing this in some of the in the reentry programs in the criminal justice system, where we're realizing that restorative justice paths are way brighter than punitive justice paths, because in separation and isolation, people aren't always learning their lesson,
Hmm.
and they're identifying with their behavior
Yeah.
rather than their opportunity for growth, rather than the opportunity for reconciliation, to make amends, and so there's tension there, right? How do we set a boundary and a limit and still also create a path for people to get that second chance,
Hmm.
ultimately dignifying all people as valuable, both victim and predator. And
Hmm.
so there's a good in humanity that we're trying to discover here, that says, hey, how do we recreate systems? How do we create opportunity for people to have that second chance without labeling people,
Hmm.
and in the midst of their difficult choices that they make? So
Yeah.
very
That's very
compelling.
good. Yeah. Well, I'm imagining that people here listening are like, how can I get more of Drew Neal? So can you talk to us about what you do and how you can invite people into what you're doing?
Yeah, certainly. So my website's drewneal.com,
Mhm.
and they can find a plethora of
Mhm.
exchanges with me, if you will.
Mhm.
I do have a coaching platform and a consultancy called Solutionary Growth. And so I'm coaching leaders, executive leaders, startup entrepreneurs, people working in politics, and helping them to really discover, kind of what problem their purpose solves. I have personal development tracks, as well as organizational development tracks, to really help people understand how to focus and mobilize who they are and their superpower, if you will,
Mhm.
into real solutions that shift organizations to get out of transaction and really grow their impact. I really focus on a lot of social and emotional growth, as well as strategies on how to execute and pull those things in. So they can find that there. I have a startup intensive for entrepreneurs called Solutionary Labs. They can find that on my site as well.
Mm-hmm.
And if you are an entrepreneur and you're wanting to get started, you want to mobilize your purpose, but you want to do well by doing good by other people, essentially, that kind of mission-minded entrepreneur, I would love to take you through my group coaching boot camp. This is a tremendous experience with 10 other entrepreneurs where you can get my solutionary framework, kind of business plan 101, funding 101, and also meet some other entrepreneurs. It's a great way. I have other trainings as well, long-term trainings that I do that have more of the faith-founded focus
Mm-hmm.
with some of my other expertise. And so people can find those things. I have a platform called Divine Intelligence, as well as focusing on this word of wisdom. And so plenty of trainings there. They can go to drewneal.com, find all the resources, and
Yeah.
connect with you there.
Yeah. It's super exciting what you're doing. And I hope to bring you out to Alaska. So for all of you Alaskans, maybe you can join us if, did I lose you, Drew? Okay, got you. Because I think you and maybe some other key influencers can help us with our solutions here in Alaska. That would be awesome. So we're still working the details out on that, but stay tuned. And yeah, thank you so much for being on the podcast. Maybe we'll do this again sometime.
Come on, Leigh. It was my pleasure. Thanks for having me on today.
Yeah.